From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
How you doing? I'm Tom Swope. Is this on? Is this working? I'm Tom Swope. I'm a volunteer with the Veterans History Project. I've interviewed right around 250 World War II veterans for the project the last 3 years, and occasionally, in case you haven't guessed or you haven't checked your program, this is the interviewing techniques panel. But occasionally I will have a person who comes up to me and asks me, how do you do these oral history interviews? And really the short answer is, ask the question and just get out of the way. Let the rest of you introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Dave Winkler. I am with the Naval Historical Foundation, which is located here down at the Naval Yard. I've been doing oral history with the foundation since 97, and we have a volunteer organization of about 75 folks around the country who are collecting oral histories with Navy veterans, sending them to us, and then we register these interviews with the Library of Congress Oral History Program. I've also done quite a few oral histories as part of that program, and also a lot of oral histories on behalf of the Library of Congress Veterans History Project. Also, I'm a commander in the Naval Reserve, so the Navy calls me up from time to time and sends me out to the ships in the fleet to interview folks about what's going on out there. And we also interview senior naval officials, so that's my background in oral history. Brian?
I'm Brian Williams. I'm the historian with the American Red Cross, and I've been doing a lot of interviews with our people, not only the ones that served during World War II, of which there are quite a number left, but also lots of other lines of service. My first experience doing oral history was in the 1960s, and I interviewed my grandmother, who probably the most important thing in her life had been the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, which she lived through. She was a young woman at the time. And so I got that family story, and just a few weeks ago, as a matter of fact, I made copies of this and shared it with other members of the family. And of course, my grandmother's long dead, but her voice and her intonation and her stories come back to life on the tape, and it's really a remarkable experience. So I have had a long-term and deeply felt appreciation for doing oral history. I'm glad to see that it's catching on.
My name is Frederick Wallace. I am a volunteer with AARP, and I am working with the AARP Georgia as coordinator of the Veterans History Project for AARP Georgia. I have been with the program for approximately a year and a half now. As you probably know, or maybe don't know, AARP is one of the founding organizations for this project, and we in Georgia support it fully. I have been involved with histories even prior to my association with this particular project. I have been interviewing veterans because during my working years, I am now retired. During my working years, I was with the Veterans Administration as a Veterans Benefits Counselor and a Veterans Assistance Counselor. And of course, in that position, I interviewed veterans to determine what they needed, what benefits they were receiving. And that, of course, sparked my interest in working with veterans. So it was just a natural for me to get involved in the Veteran History Project. So that is my background.
Actually, the first submission that I made to the Veterans History Project was not an interview at all. I was very fortunate that my father had decided 25 years ago to sit down by himself and just record tapes of his memories of the Second World War. And he actually said on those tapes that he could not have done that if I was present. So I think one of the difficult things, maybe for some people, is if they want to interview a family member, to maybe sit down with their father or mother and get them to talk. Anybody have any tips on how to get them if they're a little reluctant?
Well, you're right. It's very difficult to work with your parent. Now, I found that we've had some excellent interviews submitted to the foundation done by grandkids. For some reason, there's a bond between grandson and grandpa, or granddaughter and grandma, or grandpa, or whatever. that seems to work. We've got some excellent interviews that way. The other thing is, you mentioned do-it-yourself. For example, we have a do-it-yourself memoir kit that we have on our website, and we get quite a few interesting memoirs that way. Brian?
I don't think there's any one answer. In some families, a son or daughter can be very comfortable interviewing a parent. I know at a certain stage in my life it might have been a little difficult for me to interview my dad because we spent a lot of time arguing with each other. But I think that depends on the individuals. But I will say this, my brother is a history professor out in northern Kentucky. And for many years now, he has worked into his coursework project for his students to go out and interview their grandparents, and particularly about life in that region, which was relatively depressed during the Depression and such. And these young people come back, and they're just glowing with interest and appreciation for their grandparents, and they say things like, God, I never knew what life was like or what they went through. And so it's an incredible bonding experience that my brother has found to be quite common among the students and their grandparents.
And I found that's definitely true because I've done oral history interviews with certain veterans, and then some of the schools will send students around to do them. And the veteran will say, well, should I do this because I've already sent it to the Library of Congress? And I think really they should do it for the benefit of the students, because the student talking to the veteran firsthand is getting such valuable information. And even if that is not the same information that I got when I sat down with the veteran, it's definitely, some of it might be different than what I got, but it's definitely going to be a valuable lesson.
I think that when you're attempting to interview members of the family, particularly the older members, it takes patience, because there are a lot of memories that they have, well, certainly have forgotten or maybe repressed, and things that they don't really want to talk about, they have not talked about for a long time. So you have to be very patient with them. But I have found it valuable to just be alert, and just when you're having normal conversations, things come up that they didn't realize that they were going to talk about. But you take advantage of that opportunity to really press ahead, and you can get information that way.
And that would be rule number one. If you're going to go out and do these oral histories, whether they're with a family member or anybody else, give yourselves plenty of time, take along plenty of tape, whatever format you're using, and be patient, because there may be long periods. I've had veterans shut off the tape recorder for a little while to think. Just give yourself a lot of time. And the other thing about these oral history interviews is some of the veterans I've talked to have been intimidated by the idea that they're doing an interview, and that's not really what these are in the oral history aspect of this thing. You really want the person to talk about their life. So if I can, and I have done this, I've asked a guy maybe one question: where were you living in 1941? And he's talked for 45 minutes. That's not a problem at all. As long as he's talking about the war years, because that's what we're doing here with this project, then that'll work out just fine.
Yeah, one thing to follow on that is to open an interview, you want to, well, before you do the interview, you want to establish a rapport with the individual. You want to do something to break the ice. You want to find a common bond. Now, in my case, because I have military service, there's a common bond right there. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that case. For example, if you're a daughter and you don't have military service, but your father has military service, you can play that up. Just to, find areas where you have a commonality. Maybe you root for the same baseball team, or maybe you went to the same college or went to the same place. What I usually do, I like to go do interviews in the individual's home or office, because what I then do is I'll do the office or home scan, where I'll look around the room and see some interesting things. I did an interview with the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, Principi, and I saw a Dallas Cowboys helmet on his desk, and I'm there thinking, this guy went to the Naval Academy, Dallas Cowboys, Roger Staubach. So I opened my interview saying, so you went to the Naval Academy? He says, that's right. And did you play on the football team? He says, that's right. With Roger Staubach. And he just opened up, you know, because there was that common bond. So you need to put the interviewee at ease with something that individual's comfortable with, and then the interview will flow nicely.
It was suggested that we think about 3 or 4 points that are really important for conducting oral histories, and I jotted some down. The first one that I recommend is really prepare carefully for your interview. And that means not only making contact with the person you're going to interview, as Dave says, but also become really familiar with the subject. I would be insulting people who've fought in World War II if the terms and the campaigns and the years just were all sort of mush in my head. I need to know the sequence of events and the importance of them and so forth. So preparation is a tremendously important part of doing a good oral history. And that means not only studying it, but also making contact with the person in advance. I always talk, either visit with or on extensive telephone conversations with the person I'm going to interview. So we're already friends when the interview starts. The second thing is listening. That really, you know, you go around and see all these people on their cell phones, and you think, are they really listening, or is everyone just talking to each other? Well, listening is kind of a forgotten art, but it's terribly important in oral histories. I've had the same experience, started in oral history, and I haven't said a word for 30, 40 minutes as a person just pours forth the history of their life. So listening is very important. Appreciating. You have to show appreciation. Sometimes if an oral history is successful, people are really bringing forth important aspects of their lives. And I know we've all had this experience. I've become quite used to it now, where people break down and cry. You've touched a membrane, a vital memory from their past. And so you really have to show a real appreciation and create a very positive mood.
And that listening aspect is very important, because you can go in there and you definitely should at least look over a list of questions that you should ask in these oral histories. You can find them in the Veterans History Project kit. But really listen to what the person is saying, because something probably will come up during their conversation that will trigger probably a more interesting question, because it will be more specific to their experiences.
You touched on a lot of things. The points that you made are extremely important. First of all, preparation. The way I think I prepare is by knowing something about the individual's background. That is, if I am lucky enough to have some information on him or her before I walk into the interview. But certainly, the more information you have concerning an individual, the better the interview is going to go. But I think one of the most important things, two of the most important things, as you said, listening. Listen to the individual as he or she is talking, because they are bringing out points that you may not even be aware that's in their background. So you have to be prepared to respond to that. The other thing, which I think is most important, is being sensitive to the individual's emotional involvement in the story, because things are going to come up that will cause the individual to probably stop. Tears will come to their eyes, and you have to be prepared to wait and let them gather themselves again. The stories that you hear are stories that the individual have wanted to share for years. And rather than call it an interview, I refer to it as the veteran's story. And I usually begin by saying, this is your story. And I let the veteran tell it in his or her own way. And as you say, step back and let them talk.
Also, don't be intimidated. There's been a lot of talk up here about preparation. Usually, before I go into an interview, and I've done a lot of these, all I know is the branch of the service the guy is in and where he served, and then I go in and do it. Now, the benefit that I have is that I have been paying very close attention to World War II history since I was old enough to realize my father was in World War II. So I mean, I've been watching the TV, reading the books and all that stuff all my life, long before I ever started doing this. So if a veteran does tell me he served in the Battle of the Bulge or something like that, I know exactly when that happened. I know the sequence of events there, and I have a rough idea of what he went through, although we try to get specific in the oral history. But really, I mean, this is just the way I do it. I like it to be as fresh and spontaneous as possible. So I go in there with a certain series of questions that I want to ask the guy, but I really don't prepare very much.
Yeah, I was wondering, Tom, do you think they have some questions for us?
Yeah, that might be a wonderful idea. If anybody has any questions about how to do these oral histories.
The mic is coming to you.
A question about the tools of the trade. Do you generally always use a tape recorder, or are you, scribbling notes the whole time?
Can you repeat that? I couldn't hear it all.
I'm sorry. Is it safe to assume that you're always using a tape recorder in these interviews, or is like sort of an initial interview? And,
yeah. You have the way we do it. We use either an audio recorder or a video recorder, or both. So the individual is aware that they are being videotaped, and also there's an audio tape that is running. We use an audio tape because it's easier to transcribe from an audio tape than it is from a videotape. So yeah, we use both mediums.
Is there sometimes a problem with the subject not being comfortable being recorded?
That sometimes comes up, but I can't recall an occasion when someone has refused to do an interview because it was going to be recorded, because that has all been covered in the negotiation beforehand. There are times when I've arrived with a video camera and the person was expecting me just to come with an audio recorder, and that has caused a little bit of apprehension or hesitation, but everyone seems to comply. I don't know whether it's just my charming personality or not, but it's always worked out. So it's not really been an issue.
And it is nice to do these things on video, to get the people on video, but all of mine is exclusively audio. My background is radio, so I'm just more comfortable. Plus, I do what you mentioned. I go to the veteran's home, and that makes them a lot more comfortable, but also I'm more self-contained. It's easier for me to haul my equipment around. And I definitely know there are times when I've gotten more candid responses from the veteran, because they're just sitting there and they've kind of forgotten about the microphone in front of them, as opposed to having a camera staring down at them. But, most of these veterans get copies of the tape, so they certainly know what they had to say. Any other questions?
When dealing with family members, we have the luxury of being able to talk to them for extended periods of time. They're very comfortable with us. But my question is, do you feel that if you do sort of a pre-interview with them, you lose spontaneity? Or do you recommend doing some sort of pre-interview to know roughly where the interview will go and the types of subjects, and to even give us the opportunity to perhaps go and do a little bit of our own research on that so that we can ask more interesting questions?
Definitely. If you think you might not be familiar with the area, like I say, if you find out a little bit about where they serve and you're not familiar, then you maybe want to ask some questions about that in advance. I prefer the more spontaneous because I do know all that stuff. So I do go with the more spontaneous interview, but preparation certainly doesn't hurt.
Yeah, an opportunity to, I've had quite a few interviews where I'll sit down with an individual for lunch beforehand, or just to get to know the individual, just to build that rapport, because then when you go into the interview, I think that person will be much more comfortable with you and will be more spontaneous and a little bit more trusting with, sharing those little secrets with you. So I do think it's not a bad idea to sit down with the individual, and do a nice, talk about some of the things you're going to cover.
Yeah, that's true. But I think it depends on how the veteran comes to you for an interview. And when I say come to you, was he referred by someone? Did he or she come on their own accord? Or did family members encourage them to come. I have been in situations where the veteran comes to the interview and he says, well, I'm here because my son and my daughter told me to come. Now interview me. And that's not a good way to begin an interview. So what you do is to just start chatting for a while until he or she gets to realize that it is his story, his interview, and even though son and daughter told him to come there, he has wanted to tell this story himself for a long time. So then it becomes a real good and spontaneous interview.
However, I would add that we have been doing these interviews here for the Veterans History Project, these oral histories, and we don't know anything about the person other than say, hi, what branch of the service were you in, and then we sit down and start talking to them. Fortunately, we've all done this enough and we've heard enough that we know how to ask the questions to start to get the story and then just take it from there. But I know I sat down earlier with a gentleman for 1 hour and I got really lucky because he was very talkative and a very good storyteller, and he went. And I'm pretty sure we got everything down that he wanted to get on the videotape. And the other fortunate part is his family members were also there, and so they would nudge me and say, ask him about this. So they were very specific questions, but they got it all on videotape. Any other questions?
I just wanted to follow up on something that Tom said. When the family members are in the room, sometimes it's wise not to let the family members in the room with you. But be nice. But if they are in the room, you tell them, just please sit quietly, because this is a veteran's story. It is not the wife's story. It is not the son's story. It is the veteran's story. But when the family member is there and the veteran is having difficulty, it's good for the family member to sort of jog his memory. So it's not all bad having the family in the room.
What are some key questions that you should ask to get the conversation going?
Okay, a key question. First of all, determine what and where the veteran was in service, what branch of service he was in, when he entered the service, why he entered the service. And then you go on to his duty stations. So those are key questions. And then you find out what was probably the most memorable experience that he had during his military service.
And usually the veteran will take you in the direction that he wants to go. If he, like we were saying, a lot of the guys or women have things that they really have wanted to tell. So once you get past the general questions of all this information, they will give you a good idea of what they want to talk about.
Yeah, there are markers in history when I'm dealing with World War II veterans. Where were you on December the 7th? That's a great question because everybody remembers where they were, if they were alive on December the 7th, just like our generation knows where they were on 9/11. So that's a good question. Another question is, okay, why did you join the Navy in my case, and what brought you in? The first day of boot camp. Everybody remembers the first day at boot camp as if it was yesterday. So that's a great question. Reporting aboard your ship for the first time. You see this gray ship, or in the other services, reporting aboard your platoon. What was your first impressions? Who met you? Who greeted you? Talk a little bit about the individuals you served with. Talk about the chief, in the Navy, or your sergeant in the Army. What was the skipper like? And then, of course, you go into the different actions they talked about. Of course, where were you when Roosevelt died is a very good question for the World War II generation. They all remember where they were when they heard that word. And, of course, when the bomb was dropped, what was your reaction to that? So those are very good questions for the World War II generation. There are similar questions for, like, Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. So, where were you when the war started type things.
Yeah, I agree. This is all excellent advice. Two points I'd add. One is a good question to start out with is to ask someone where they were born and raised and education. And that has two purposes. One, to sort of put everything that follows into context, but it also gets them talking with something that doesn't require very much reminiscence and whatnot. We all know where we were born and raised. And so it's an easy way to lead into the interview. And to go back to a question before, I was surprised when I started doing them on video. I thought people would be kind of apprehensive and whatnot. Once they get launched into the interview, the technical aspect of things just seem to evaporate. They just ignore the camera. It's really remarkable. And one other point, one question that I find quite useful is to ask someone to tell me about how a typical day would go in their work. And I always, when I say that, I always am reminded, I had the opportunity to do a number of interviews with John Glenn. And I covered not his space story as much as I did his war stories. And I asked him that question about his being a fighter pilot during the Korean War. And he told a day from beginning to end that I will never forget. And the way he put in context being up in the air, up by the Yalu River, with MiGs above him, and just painted that picture. It was incredible, absolutely incredible. And that all came from just a simple question. Tell me, you take off in the morning and what happens? So that's a good question. And one other question I sometimes ask people is, if you had a day in your life, in my case in the Red Cross, let's say, to live over again, what would that day be? And that has produced some sort of miraculous results too, as people think of one day that was really joyous or very meaningful to them.
And he mentioned that December 7th question, and that is usually one of the first questions I will also ask. And sometimes you get really, really good detailed stories about December 7th. Other times you don't, but it definitely takes them back there. They start thinking about that time, and it really starts it rolling.
Okay. Two questions. If you or the veteran says, well, why do you want my story? How do you answer that? And my other question, do you limit the time or amount of information that veteran? I know you don't want to wear out the veteran and just keep going and going, and all of a sudden they're asleep or something like that. What do you recommend?
As far as the Library of Congress is concerned, they say they only want 90 minutes. I've cheated a few times. They say they only want 90 minutes maximum, but I have talked to veterans for 3 hours or more and give the library the best 90 minutes. So like I say, give yourself plenty of time, because there may be something he'll say in the second or third hour that you wish you had. So give yourself plenty of time.
I think that it is very unlikely that the veteran will tire of the interview or will go to sleep, because once he gets into the story, he begins to relive it and he becomes alive again. So I don't think that that is a problem. But again, you have to be sensitive to that. And if you think that the veteran is tiring, then maybe it's time to bring it to a close. But I don't think that that is going to be much of a problem.
Well, frankly, I think the bigger problem from time to time is the interviewer getting sleepy.
And did you also ask about when a veteran says he doesn't think his story is important? Well, you can only do so much, but you definitely have to convince them that their story is part of history. All these little pieces are important. But there are some veterans that I know I've come across with really interesting stories that simply won't talk, won't go on record. You can't do anything about it.
One thing, I get calls almost weekly, sometimes daily, from children and grandchildren of veterans who died 20, 30 years ago, and they're asking questions about ships. They're asking questions about duty stations. They want to know something about Grandpa. Where was Grandpa? And I'm able to provide a lot of material, sometimes pictures, histories of ships, and that kind of brings the grandchild connects with the grandfather who's been long deceased. And I pass that on to the grandfathers who are still alive, and I say, hey, you know, this is an opportunity, because someday your grandkid may want to know about what you did during the war. Maybe he or she doesn't care right now, but they will, and you'll have this story on hand at a location such as the Library of Congress. It doesn't get any better than that, really, where they can access this, and I think that's kind of neat.
Any other questions?
I'm sorry, I didn't know you were there. That brings up the question about what will be the fate of these tapes, and is anybody planning on transcribing them, because tapes will eventually melt away? And how do you access the tapes once they are in the Library of Congress?
Get a little closer. We didn't hear that one.
She wanted to know.
Okay.
What will be the history of the tapes that you make? Are you going to have them transcribed? They will melt away as tapes eventually. Are they going to be cross-indexed? What will you do with them at the Library of Congress?
Well, I don't do anything. I'm a volunteer. I'm out there in the field. The Library of Congress, as I know it, they put these tapes in the archive. They are going through the process of making transcriptions of these tapes, and that is a very lengthy process. We've got someone who will tell us all about this. This is Peter Bardis from the Library of Congress.
In answer to the question about the tapes, the National Association of Court Reporters has volunteered to transcribe all the tapes over time, and they will be digitized and preserved at the Library of Congress and available to the public for all to see and hear at the American Folklife Center's reading room. And of course, it'll take time to organize all this, and we continue to do it as they come in, but happily we have a backlog, which is very good.
That's all? We're getting you a microphone, and you look very familiar.
Okay, now, have you ever encountered a situation where the person whom you are interviewing seems to be embellishing the story? And if you suspect that, how do you deal with it? In answer to your question, yes. Yeah, it happens that the veteran is embellishing his story because that's the way he wants to remember it. And there's very little you can do about that unless he really goes too far afield. And then you can probably just start another question to start him on another tack. But as long as he doesn't get too outlandish, then just let him talk himself out. Anybody else wants to respond to that?
I don't worry too much about that, because as a historian, what I do is I used to be a navigator when I was at sea, and when you're a navigator, what you do to get a good fix is you get 3 lines of bearing. Okay, so if somebody says something in an interview, I usually, for my writing history, I try and get a cross-check, another line of bearing from another interviewee or another, or like an official record. And if they check out, then I use it in my history book that I'm writing. If not, then if it kind of seems fishy, I might not use it. So.
And I have found that when they realize they're doing this for the Library of Congress, they don't do a whole lot of embellishing. And I've never come across anyone who said he shot Hitler or anything like that. So I think most of the guys that I've talked to have been very honest, and they realize how serious this is, and they want to get their story down right. So I really haven't had a problem with anybody doing any of that.
Just a minute, I just want to make a point following up on the question that was asked there. I was interviewing a veteran, and he kept making reference to a young girl that he had to meet when he got out of the service. And of course, I thought that this was a girlfriend of his. But as he was telling the story, it turned out that it was not a girlfriend, that it was actually a young girl, and it was the daughter of a veteran, of a buddy of his. And it seems that this veteran and another veteran and his buddy were in the POW camp. And the camp was, am I still on? Okay. And the Germans were saying that they're going to close the camp and they're going to relocate the veterans to another location. The veteran's buddy had left home while his wife was pregnant. And he really wanted to get back to see his new child. Unfortunately, he did not get back, but the veteran was going to do that for him. So he wanted to get back to the United States, and he wanted to see this girl so that he could tell her, okay, this is better, so that he could tell her what her father was like. So when he made reference to the girl he wanted to get back to, he was talking about the daughter of his buddy. So what may sound outlandish to begin with, maybe it is not.
I just wanted to ask a question. If y'all are taking interviews and you're gathering everyone else's history, it's a history in and of itself of what you're doing. Is anyone capturing that, and are you sharing your experiences of what you're doing? Because that's a lost art, and it doesn't need to be lost. If you don't do it yourself, then you're not giving someone else the opportunity to learn, and the next generation won't know how to come behind you and do it.
I do have a reporter who's in the Cleveland area who's been real nice about doing stories about what I'm doing periodically, so she's helping, certainly. Anybody else?
Well, this is an opportunity to put on another hat. I'm a vice president of an organization called OMAR, which is the Oral History Mid-Atlantic Region. There are oral history associations throughout the country, up in New England, Michigan, down Texas, Southwest Oral History Association. And they have web pages, and they have annual conferences, and they have workshops. For example, the Omar Oral History Workshop is going to be this upcoming October here at the Library of Congress. Brian's going to be doing an excellent workshop on video. So there are opportunities for you to get involved with these associations. Of course, there's the Oral History Association, which is the national organization. Of course, there's a Folklife Association that also deals with this type of stuff also. So that's one way that we keep this profession going.
Any other questions?
Yes, I'm curious whether or not you've had occasion to interview someone multiple times, and if so, what was the outcome as you proceeded?
Multiple times as in a continuing interview, or?
More than one sitting.
More than one sitting? Well, I'm still not done talking to Venus Ramey, if that helps you at all.
Yeah, I have. And the whole design of the project was different because I had, in one case, 16 interview sessions with one person. And so we move very, very incrementally through that person's life. Typically, my interviews are about 2 hours in length. And we talked about time a little earlier. And 2 hours is just about as long as you can go and be fresh. And I'll say this. I didn't anticipate this when I started doing oral history. It is exhausting. If you're doing a good job and if you are actively listening, it wears you out. And so after 2 hours, on occasions I've done 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, and I'm wiped at the end of the day, absolutely. So that's...
And you're a better man than I cannot do 2 of these in one day.
I don't ever want to do it, but occasionally you have to.
Exactly. Any other questions?
Yes, I was wondering if you could touch on group interviews. You talk about speaking with individuals. Do you do group interviews?
Particular interviews that we've done?
No, group interviews.
Group interviews, as in having a group of veterans sit around and talk?
Exactly.
That had been suggested, and I've done a few of those things informally. The problem is then you do get a little more embellishing when you've got 3 veterans sitting around BSing and that sort of thing. If that's the only way to do it, do it. I mean, I think you'd get a much more personal story. You get a lot more detail if you could sit down with people individually. Anybody else try that?
Well, there are pro and cons, because sometimes the exchange among people bring out a lot of interesting information. And sometimes you can get a sense of kind of the character of a unit or a group who've worked together. But I guess I recommend basically to do one-on-ones. You probably get more information in the end. Another interesting thing is sometimes people will defer to one another. And so like if you have I'm not good on military terms here, but if you have a boss man and workers, and you're trying to get the whole story about what it was like to be both a boss and a worker, the workers will tend to defer to the boss, and so you're not getting the whole story. It's a kind of complicated answer, but I found that to be true.
Yeah, and just one technical thing is if you have a group interview and it's going to be transcribed, if you have individuals with the same sounding voice, you need to work something in where they're identified. Otherwise, you don't know who's talking. That's just something, a technicality you got to work into. I've done group interviews with pilots. Unfortunately, half the time they're talking with their hands like this, and that doesn't translate very well on audio tape. So that's another consideration.
Any other questions?
We have one over here.
Yeah, I have a comment that maybe you can respond to. I spent some time going to ships reunions with my dad and talking to the veterans before I ever heard of the Veterans History Project. And one of the things that I come away with is that the enlisted men seem to have a different story than the officers. And having known a lot of the stories, they will not go on the record, even when they could literally rewrite the history of a battle, mistakes that were made, etc. So I don't find embellishing. I find talking to people, just talking to them, you get a lot of very interesting historical information, but trying to get veterans to go on the record when there are instances, for lack of a better word, mistakes, incompetence, screw-ups, they will not go on the record against an officer of a ship. And my brother, who is a military officer, or was at the time, would say, try to document, these things with these guys, because they could literally rewrite a battle. And I've checked and looked up the official record of the ship's logs, the after-action reports, read official naval accounts, and none of these things are in the official record. I also went out to Pearl Harbor for the 60th reunion and listened to accredited historians talk about what happened at a battle. And I called up a few guys who were there and said, is this the case? And they said no. So you find, if you're lucky, folks who were there and who know will talk. But most of my experience is off the record, they'll tell you what really happened. And it's a very interesting, for somebody who's interested in history, as I am, it's a very interesting dilemma or situation. So I just wanted to make a comment because so much talk was done about embellishing that my experience is the opposite, and it's absolutely fascinating.
And that's definitely true. You can't make someone talk about something they won't talk about, period. But I've definitely had people hint at officers doing the wrong things, and I have had at least a few occasions where a veteran would specifically say, Library of Congress, I want you to know this guy's name, and he put it on tape. But then, of course, he signs a release afterwards. So,
I just wanted to respond to that as well. That is one of the more valuable aspects of this program. We have heard the official version of the war. We've heard the official version of incidents. We hear what General so-and-so says. But to really get the actual true picture of what happened day by day, you get it from the individuals who were out there in the foxhole, who was out there facing the enemy face to face. And the person who says, why do you want my story? That's why we want your story, to tell it like it is.
Yeah, I have a comment that basically the way history was written and presented up and through the 1960s was the great white man's view of history, whereas it was all the American history was a history of American leaders, and at that time was mostly white males. So you had histories of admirals and generals and presidents, and there was very little history of like working folks, the folks who were out there doing the job day to day. As part of the 60s and 70s, there came this new history coming up, and well, I like to say in the Navy, history from the deck plates up, and where you have these programs such as the Library of Congress Veterans History Program, outreaching to the folks who actually did the jobs day to day. They peeled the potatoes, they fired the guns, and we're a much richer society because of that, because the histories that are being written today based on some of these oral histories are much, much more realistic and accurate and give a much better portrayal of what happened during these calamitous times in our history.
So if you do decide to do this, if you want to talk to a family member or you want to go out in the community and grab a lot of veterans like I've done, there are Veterans History Project kits available. You can go to their website. They'll give you a list of questions. They'll really walk you through it so that you can talk to anybody and really do that. The important thing is turn on a mic and let them.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.